You just watch. Today's lesson is 1-4 properties of numbers. So again, make sure you're taking good notes, writing a question, and we'll get started. So the first thing I have for you today is a lot of properties. A lot of properties. So I'm going to let you write some of them down. Eventually I'm going to pull down the screen a little bit so you can get the rest of them. So go ahead and pause. Here, we'll move this down just a little bit. You don't have to write this whole thing. If you just want to write the number examples on the numbers or the examples with the variables, that's fine, but make sure you get all the properties. So go ahead and pause and write them down, and then pretty soon I'll move down the thing. All right, I'm going to go back to the top and I'm going to talk about them a little bit. So commutative property, you can see there's a commutative property of addition and multiplication. Notice that if you look at the examples, it's the same thing. The only thing that's different are the signs. So what commutative means is that you can change the order of things and it still equal the same thing. So 6 plus 2 still equals 2 plus 6. And 5 times 2 still equals 2 times 5. So commutative, I remember talking about this last year a little bit with you guys. It's like a community where you just change, if you move, you just change spots. Okay, the next one is the associative property, the same thing. It has the associative addition and associative multiplication. Notice how these two things both have parentheses. The parentheses can move and it still equals the same thing. So you know 3 plus 5 plus 1 is same as 3 plus 5 plus 1. It has to have the same sign throughout the. Notice how the associative property of addition and multiplication, the parentheses just change spots, but it still equals the same thing. I think last year I talked about a story about going to Pizza Ranch where two friends were walking in the front and all of a sudden the second one wanted to walk on the way home. It was still the same group of three friends to and from Pizza Ranch. If you remember, that's what I talked about a little bit. So most of the time, associative property will always have parentheses. So that should be a good indicator. If it's got parentheses, it's kind of a good indicator of what that property is. Okay, the next one is additive identity. If you look at, it's when you add 0, because anytime you add 0, it's going to be just the same number. So like I have there 5 plus 0 equals 5. It's always just the same number. So additive identity is when you add 0. Sometimes people get additive identity and property of 0 mixed up. The next one is multiplicative identity. It's when you're multiplying anything by 1, because if you think about it, if you multiply anything by 1, it's still the same number, kind of like additive identity above. So it's, when you ask you what your identity is, it's your name. And if you look at this, it's like this number saying its name, like 5 plus 0 is 5, 3 times 1 is 3. So multiplicative identity is when you multiply anything by 1, it's just the same number. Property of 0 is multiplying something by 0 and the answer being 0. So that's pretty easy. Property of 0 means when you multiply by 0, it doesn't matter what number you multiply by, the answer is always 0. All right, so in your homework today, this is kind of what it's going to look like a little bit. It's going to give you some examples and it's going to ask you what property we have going on here. So if I look at this one right here, number 1, 8 times 9 is the same as 9 times 8. Think about what property that would have been. And it was commutative. If you want to abbreviate, you can abbreviate, that's fine. This one, we'll talk about at a later date. That's the distributive property. That pretty much has its own section. This one right here, notice it has parentheses. That's the associative property. And if I do this one right here, A times B is the same as B times A. That's the commutative property. Okay, I'm going to add a few more here. Let's try this one. Think about what that one would be again. Think about what this one would be again. Okay, so this is multiplicative. Oh, I can't spell. Property. And this one would be 0 property. this is also called multiplicative identity also. Another thing that is in homework today, or another vocabulary word, is called counterexample. And this is an example that shows that a statement isn't true. Like I said last year, if you're a person that likes to argue, this is for you. So it's basically proving something wrong. So an example would be if someone say, I think 4 is a prime number. The counterexample would be to prove why it's not true. Well, if you know what a prime number is and a composite number is only one in itself, goes in a prime number, has, a composite number has many numbers that go into it. A prime number is only one in itself. So an example is this is not true because I know that 1, 2, and 4 all go into the number. Okay, that's an example. Another example would be division is commutative. If I'd say division is commutative, I would say not true. And then you have to say because, not true because. Well, I know division isn't commutative because I know that 12 divided by 4 is not the same as 4 divided by 12. Okay? It's not commutative. It's not going to be the same thing on both sides. So a counterexample is proving that something is not true. If I would say that every month ends in Y, you would say, well, that's not true because August doesn't end in Y, September doesn't end in Y, October doesn't end in Y. So that would be a counterexample of to why not all months end in Y. Okay, the last thing you're going to have to do today is simplify algebraic expressions. Okay, so simplifying is writing expressions as simple as possible. So today you don't have to evaluate, you just have to write the expression in the smallest possible form using the properties that we talked about today. So a lot of times what you're just going to do is you're going to find the two things that you can put together. So if I look at k plus 5, they're in parentheses, plus 8. If I look at that, what are the two things that can go together there? Well, I know that 5 and 8 are the things that can be added together. So what they want you to do is they want you to take those parentheses and they want you to move them so those 5 and that 8 can be in the same parentheses. Then they want you to simplify as far as possible. Okay, so the last one we have 5 times parentheses d times 9 end of parentheses. So if I look at those two things, what can go together? You're probably thinking the 5 and the 9. So according to the properties, what we're going to do is we're going to flip these two things. So it's going to be d times 5 times 9, and there we use the commutative property because we just flipped two things out. And then the answer would be d times 45. Okay? So let's try a few more here. I have 7 parentheses 3 times c. Now some students get this confused, but honestly this is what it looks like. That's what it looks like. So the things I can put together, this right here, this would be 21 times c. And then below I have 1 plus parentheses 6 plus d and a parentheses. Here I can just use the associative property, move my parentheses, and I get 7 plus d. So the only thing you got to be careful is pretty much is what sign are you using. Are you doing multiplication or are you doing addition? Those are the only two signs you're going to see because those are the only two things that can use associative property and commutative property. So the only thing you're going to deal with are multiplying and addition. That's really all of today's lesson. So make sure that you took some notes, that you have some good examples, and come with a question tomorrow. I'll see you then.